Hello and welcome to the Bitcoinlens podcast, episode 11. Today I'm going to go over the September update. So all the news from September, some interesting news on the financial side, on the Bitcoin side, and some of the nation state side as it pertains to Bitcoin. So before I continue here, don't forget to give me a follow on X at EmilBTC. And also I'm on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and rate my podcast and share it with everyone else, so we can kind of help each other, educating the masses on Bitcoin and spreading the word a little bit. So with that being said, let me kick this off. So first of all, on the ETF front, the US ETF front, so we have another 5,600 Bitcoin purchased in the last week or so. So that's a bunch of ETF Bitcoin there, funneling through the US ETFs, with BlackRock leading the pack there with, I think they bought about 1,420 Bitcoin. Fidelity right after them, just over 1,000 Bitcoin. Bitwise also stacked a lot. But if you look at just the biggest players there, BlackRock and Fidelity, they now hold a combined 536,000 Bitcoin, worth at about $34 billion of Bitcoin. So that is an extreme amount. Keep in mind, from a custody perspective, Fidelity, they're self-custody. BlackRock is not. BlackRock, you get your custody there via Coinbase. But that's besides the point. That's a ton of Bitcoin bought there for just this last week that we've seen from the US ETFs. In other news, we saw BNY, which is a major bank in New York, and they approved for Bitcoin custody by the SEC. So BNY is a massive bank, and Gary Gensler, he basically pointed out that their individual wallet structure is, what protects customers, and therefore he now allows custody there beyond the regular ETFs. And this is kind of the fight we've been seeing in Congress, and it's passed Congress, been vetoed by Biden. The SAB 121 having banks custody Bitcoin. So nice to see some progress being made here. And hopefully this can be kind of a domino effect and funnel through to some of the other banks. But yeah, major bank there getting approval for Bitcoin custody. So moving on, PayPal, they approved Bitcoin for business accounts. So now if you have a PayPal business account, you can now hold, sell, buy Bitcoin and other crypto as well. And this was announced about a week ago. So big announcement there from PayPal. Since, I know my international friends and a lot of folks local use PayPal, so widely adopted exchange wallet there. Just makes the access a little bit easier for the mainstream. For those folks who don't really want to go onto crypto exchanges or get soft wallets, hard wallets, or mess with peer to peer, this is a great way where you could just easily hold Bitcoin and before you move on to maybe a more advanced stage like a soft wallet or something like that. So Standard Chartered, massive bank, $67 billion assets under management, and they predict that Bitcoin is going to hit $200,000 kind of by the election, and regardless of who wins the election. So this was their head of digital assets that made this prediction. So as you've probably seen through some of my previous podcasts, I don't really care too much about the price of Bitcoin. However, seeing traditional finance, banks like this make these predictions is kind of eye-opening, right? If you kind of poll these banks 5 years ago, they would have all said Bitcoin's going to zero. So it's just amazing for me to see like the two sectors converge. The crypto OGs or the crypto punks converge with traditional finance, and you're seeing banks make predictions like that. That is just one prediction I've seen. I've seen way higher. Cathie Wood, she's made some massive predictions as well with ARK. $1 million Bitcoin by end of next year, things like that. But like I said, don't get too focused on price. None of these folks will really truly know. But one thing that I do gather from that is that Bitcoin shows them to have tremendous value. And regardless of what that exact prices they're predicting, they're all predicting there's going to be huge value and huge adoption. And that's really all that matters. That's what I really gain from that. No, this was also a big one from the SEC standpoint. They approved options for BlackRock's spot Bitcoin ETF. So BlackRock, obviously, they've been approved since early this year for the spot Bitcoin ETF. But then September 20, the SEC announced that they're now going to allow options on the spot Bitcoin ETF, which basically just allows an investor to kind of generate some yield from, holding Bitcoin. And, investors can essentially just sell their call options and then collect premiums on that. And then, obtain a yield from that in a more regulated manner now. So that's pretty interesting, and I'm kind of curious to see how that plays out, because that is one thing that a lot of folks talk about with Bitcoin, is that you don't necessarily get that yield, that monthly yield, or by annual yield, or whatever that time range may be. But this could be a good option for folks to earn a little bit of yield off that Bitcoin. Moving on a little more here to MicroStrategy. So, MicroStrategy, of course, big technology company led by Michael Saylor. If you don't know Michael Saylor by now, he is a massive, massive Bitcoin proponent and almost seen as one of the pioneers, even though he's only recently, like when I say recently, come into Bitcoin in the last 4 years or so. They've just acquired another 7,400 Bitcoin here in the last couple of weeks, worth about $458 million at an average at about $61,000 per Bitcoin. So as of September 19th, they hold about 252,000 Bitcoin. And this is about an average price of $39,000 that they acquired Bitcoin for. Like I said, they started 2020, I believe it was August 2020. And MicroStrategy, just to give you perspective, if you're not really super familiar with them, they're beating everything right now. They're beating the S&P 500. They're beating Nvidia as far as the last 4 years. They're beating everything on the S&P 500, all index funds, Nvidia, and Bitcoin itself. So their yield that they've made in the last, or their returns have been quite astonishing in the last 4 years. So really, really great move there by MicroStrategy, and Michael Saylor really sticking to his guns, and he continues to stack Bitcoin on his balances there, on his balance sheet there. So moving on to Germany, Commerzbank, 500 billion assets under management. Commerzbank, they're actually going to start offering Bitcoin and crypto trading now. So good news there for Germany and Europe there. Also, on that front, Deutsche Digital Assets, they've now got a new macro ETP, which is essentially the same as the ETF. That's just kind of their product there. They're also named an ETP. That's what they call it there in Europe. But essentially the same thing as an ETF. And that started on September 19th. So another big one there for Europe. So as we saw, the US kind of led the pack there, right? The 11 big US ETFs. And now we see the whole rest of Earth, like pretty much adopting ETPs, ETFs. And you even have places like Hong Kong. They've got in-kind ETFs, meaning you can essentially exchange your ETF or your ETF holding, your ETF share holdings. You can exchange that in kind for Bitcoin. So there's some really creative things we're seeing out there too. But the main point I'm trying to make here, great news. We're seeing Deutsche Digital Assets now obtaining an ETP, and the ETP ETF wave just keeps kind of going across the globe. So, other news, publicly traded company Cathedra has adopted Bitcoin as its primary treasury reserve asset. So, this is kind of following the mold of MicroStrategy and some other companies, but really good to see more companies. I predict we're going to see a bunch of companies adopt this strategy, putting it on as a reserve asset and holding it as a reserve asset and stacking it, and making that a big part of their balance sheet. So I think that's something we're going to see really, really ramp up here in the next year or so. And that's why I keep telling everyone is we're so early. Like Wall Street is only now this year kind of dipped their toes in Bitcoin, and corporations are barely even touching the surface. Like, I mean, you really only have like one or two significant companies who've made a big, um, made a big Bitcoin holding there, or big stacking of the last year or so, like MicroStrategy. But great to see companies like Cathedra also jumping on the ship now. Going on to Singapore, so DBS, Singapore's largest bank, they announced plans to launch Bitcoin and crypto options. So kind of similar to what I was saying earlier, you're going to be able to make a little bit of yield out of Bitcoin through options, through call options, and options trading, and basically structured notes as well. Is what they announced. So we'll see what happens there. But this is great news for Singapore there, and yeah, this is really interesting. Before I move on to the country state here, I wanted to just remind you that SpaceX still holds 8,285 Bitcoin as of September this year. So I know they don't, SpaceX, Tesla. I know Tesla there at one point they took in Bitcoin to purchase cars, to purchase their Teslas, but it's still promising to see that Elon's still holding a bunch of Bitcoin there. So if you didn't believe in it, now, I mean, I would say like he's probably someone you could look at, right? If someone like that is still holding Bitcoin, you probably got to ask yourself, why is he holding it, right? He realizes this is a hedge against inflation. This is a great store of value, and he can see where this is going. So great to see them still holding on to 8,000 Bitcoin there, which is an incredible amount. Moving on to China. So China, they basically announced, this was like I believe a week ago. They announced multiple rate cuts just after the Fed cut rates. So basically, we're seeing kind of a domino effect with the U.S., China cutting rates, and historically, as you can see with the Bitcoin price, right after these rate cut announcements, you see the Bitcoin price jump, and that's kind of been an historical trend. So once you see rate cuts, and I'm expecting more rate cuts, as inflation eases a little bit. And I'm expecting more. Like, if Trump is president next year, I think you're going to see massive rate cuts, kind of like he did in his first term. Now, obviously, we don't know who's going to be president, but either way, I expect at least more rate cuts here in the next 6 months or so. So Bitcoin, as we could see, really like that news, and it's really spiked a lot since the rate cut announcements in China and US and other places. Also, just to kind of move on to the Treasury side, I know we always talk about the Treasuries and why that's important, right? Just kind of holding that US debt. And we saw China's Treasuries are down, China's US Treasuries are down $780 billion. So I know I talked about this. If you haven't listened to my episode on my concerns for the US dollar, that covers that pretty nicely and in depth. But we're at a 15-year low for China holding US Treasuries. And over the last 3 years, China's Treasury holdings have declined by 30%, or $300 billion. Since the 2013 peak of Treasury holdings by China, China has dumped a total of $540 billion in U.S. Treasuries. So you can see they're moving one way. We've already talked about BRICS, them announcing a new currency, China importing gold, and BRICS probably going to be working and trading off this new backed currency by BRICS. So no surprises there. But keep in mind, this is a pretty big holder. This is top two treasury holders in the world of US debt. And as that debt gets sold off, what does that mean? That means the US needs to print more dollars, which means inflation is in the near future again, unless we do things like get energy dependence and adopt Bitcoin strategy, creative things like that. That could really put a damper on the debt and deficit. But interesting news here from China. Now, keep in mind, China, as much as they've banned Bitcoin mining, they still have 55% of the mining hash rate. Now, the mining pools are owned 40% by US companies. So keep in mind that even though the hash rate may be coming out of China, it could still be hash rate or miners that's contributing to that mining pool, those US mining pools out of China. So the US is still the dominant mining pool holder or owners, but definitely 55% of mining hash rate coming out of China. So even though they've got the mining ban there and talks of it really disappearing soon, it's still interesting there to see that they've got a lot of hash rate there coming out of China. This was kind of interesting news. This was like a week ago. I read this. The Kingdom of Bhutan announced it has nearly a third of its GDP in Bitcoin, which means they own more Bitcoin than El Salvador. So as we talked about on some of these previous podcasts, game theory, once it starts, once countries see other countries adopt it and they see the fruits of the labor, this is going to be a trickle effect. It's going to be a domino effect. So great to see Bhutan, Bhutan's leadership there really being smart there and adopting a Bitcoin strategy and putting that on their reserves and in their reserves. So really interesting to see. And this was kind of a surprise to the Bitcoin community when this came out about a week ago. And I really think we're going to see more countries adopt this. So finally, here we saw German Parliament member Joanna Kotar said she will be passing out some Bitcoin for beginner books in Parliament. So I thought that was kind of a funny story and also a promising story of how folks like this, really, really leaders in the Bitcoin industry are going on the ground floor and actually passing out Bitcoin content on the ground floor and starting to educate some of these political leaders. So that is a lot of news I just covered there. That's a bunch of interesting highlights there. But really, Bitcoin, the price, everything, the price is looking great. Bitcoin adoption is looking great. The community is still thriving. And, if you haven't listened to some of my other podcasts, like Why Bitcoin, I've had some interesting interviews with CJ Konstantinos and Rajat Soni and folks like that as far as like their opinion. And they're really deep into the financial sector historically. And they get some really good opinions on like where this price is going, why it's going there, and how it intertwines with with our geopolitical space and the global economy. So some really good listens there. Remember to follow me, like this, subscribe, share, and thank you for tuning in. That'll be all for the September update. Hopefully that was insightful. I'll catch you all on the next podcast. Thank you.